Hey, everybody, welcome. We'll just give it a minute so the people can join. Okay. So I'm just going to get us started. So welcome, everybody. Today we have Laura Doval from Colombia, which is going to talk to us about Persuasion and Welfare, which is joint work with Alex Smolin. We're also very happy to have two guest panelists, Ricardo Alonso and Kai-Hao Yang. The format is the usual one. Laura will have 1 hour for the presentation, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion. We often stay a little bit longer than 15 minutes just to say goodbye, to maybe allow for additional questions if Laura and the panelists are available, but there's no obligation to do that. Let me just remind you that this is recorded. And finally, next week, we'll have Ernesto Rivera Mora from Arizona, and his talk is going to be neutral mechanisms on the feasibility of information sharing. I think that's all. So, Laura, please.
Well, thank you so much for having me at Virtual Seminars in Economic Theory, and also to Ricardo and Kai-Hao for agreeing to be our panelists. We're very much looking forward to your feedback. This is, as Francesco said, this is joint work with Alex Smolin, and Alex has been very kind to avoid me the pain of presenting in front of a co-author, which makes me very nervous, but that means that I'm flying solo. So feel free to interrupt with questions, and Francesco has been very kind to agree that if you're shy and you want to send a question through the chat, he will pass them along. So without further ado, basically, I think it's becoming more uncommon to think about using information as a policy tool to make decisions in high-stakes domains. And if I prompt you with this, most probably you will think that of examples along the lines of algorithms determining scores or ratings or recommendations, for instance, to decide who gets bail or not, who gets a job, what kind of treatment that you will receive, the kind of education that you might get, and whether you get credit. But maybe it's because that I'm very old school, but by no means this is something that belongs to the big data economy or to artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. We've been using things like the FICO score to determine as a coarse measure of someone's creditworthiness as a function of their characteristics. We have been using tests and grade disclosure policies to decide how to allocate high school students to college and college students to jobs or MBAs to jobs. But something that I will grant to the hype of algorithms and whatnot is that it has made us very aware that even something that looks innocuous as an information recommendation can have very big impact in terms of welfare, and this impact can be very heterogeneous across different individuals, which also makes us start thinking about whether the policies that we have in place are actually the ones that we would like to have in place. But for that, to think about which policies will be optimal, we need to have a framework in which we can evaluate the trade-offs of choosing between different information policies. And as I hope it will become clear throughout the talk, even though for some instances we have the tools to think about what the optimal policy should be in a particular setting, we don't have a unified framework to think about the welfare trade-offs between different information policies in a way that is both systematic and it doesn't depend on the particular goal that you have in your application. So basically, the proposal for this paper is to provide a framework that will allow us to study the welfare impact of information policies in a population of heterogeneous individuals in a way that we will be able to talk about the welfare trade-offs when we're choosing between different information policies. And then once you give me your objective function, the framework will help you decide which information policy you want to implement. So more formally, we will be looking at a model where there's a unit mass population of agents with characteristics in a finite type space theta 1 through theta n. And we will have full support distribution that I'm going to call mu naught that will describe the frequency with which agents in the population have the different characteristics. And the primitive in our model is going to be what we call the welfare function. And it will describe the welfare of individuals with a given characteristic as a function of an unmodeled outside observer's belief about her type. We're going to follow an information design approach, and we're going to model information policies basically as information structures. And just for common knowledge, an information structure is going to be a set of labels S and a collection of conditional probability distributions that says how different characteristics are mapped to distributions over this set of labels.
So Laura, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So
No,
I'm sorry to interrupt you right from the start, but I just wanted to point out, or for you to tell us, you're not imposing any restriction on this welfare function, right? So this is a function from beliefs and states to the real line, period.
Exactly. Yes, we're not saying
so,
anything.
So it's a little bit more general, but it's bounded. but it's not. So you're not imposing any structure. So your initial results dealing with characterizing what is achievable, what is attainable, are really very general. They're not, let's say, restricted to some notion of welfare.
No, you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Okay. No.
So basically, the outside observer for us will be like a black box that performs base rule. So the outside observer will observe the signal, but will not observe the individual's characteristic and will form a posterior about the distribution of types in the population. So how do we think about this framework given the applications that I was mentioning at the beginning? Think about the judge granting bail. You could think that the individual's characteristics, amongst other things, summarize the probability of recidivism. And the outside observer is the judge that will be determining as a function of the belief that he has about whether the individual will commit a crime or not when granted bail, whether they will grant bail or not. And they have a prior over the characteristics of the individuals, but also will receive a recommendation from an algorithm. And given this, they will update their beliefs and make a choice about whether to grant bail or not. So in this case, the welfare function, you can think of it as the composition between the individual's payoff from being granted bail, but also the judge's willingness to grant bail as a function of their beliefs. An example that I think is closer to us is Holmstrom, that will also fit in this model. So think about the individual's characteristics being their ability, and the outside observer is the market, and or the job market, we would call it. And the job market pays wages as equal to the expected ability that the individual has. And then you can think that the welfare function is precisely the wages that the market pays. And the information structure is, for instance, test scores that will reveal some information about the individual's ability. And as a function of the test scores, we're going to determine the wages. Now, if you give me the welfare function and you give me an information structure, I can construct something that we're going to call a welfare profile, which is an assignment of a welfare level to individuals with different characteristics, and it's namely the conditional expectation under the information structure of the welfare function for the characteristic theta. So this is the expected welfare of individuals of type theta under the information policy. And we're going to call the welfare profiles that are induced by information structure the base welfare profiles. And the main object that we're going to define in the paper is a base welfare set, which is a set of all base welfare profiles. So it's a set of welfare profiles that can be induced by some information structure. So all the results of the paper are going to be tools to characterize and to analyze the properties of the base welfare set. So what is the base welfare set? You can think of the base welfare set as the utility possibility set in an economy where the planner is choosing information structures instead of allocations. And it describes everything that is feasible. And that's why I said that then you give me your social welfare function. And I think that as economists, we're more used to thinking about objective functions that depend on the welfare of the individuals rather than objective functions that depend directly on the information structure. You give me your objective function, you evaluate it on the set. And that will be your expression of the trade-offs between the welfare of different individuals, and that will determine the information structure that you choose. So if you're thinking about studying the welfare implications of market segmentations or grading or recommendations and rating systems, this will be the kind of object that will be in the background of your analysis.
Sorry, just to clarify the notation. Does this welfare set depend on type realization, or because the right-hand side has a theta in there, the left-hand side doesn't?
So no, but this is for all I.
For all.
So we're taking the vectors, and the vector coordinate by coordinate has to coincide with the welfare of those individuals with a given characteristic under the information structure.
For a fixed realized type profile.
No, but there's some.
Because the theta is individual's type.
Yes.
And there's a distribution of those types.
Yes.
And I guess I probably it's just me and don't want to take too much of her time, but the
no. But this is I think I can. So the analysis will be coherent, but you're right. And now I'm wondering where we should. There might be some notation optimization that we have to do, but I think so you can think of this as each individual knows their type, and all the uncertainty that remains. So the type realization is fixed, but all the uncertainty that remains is from the point of view of the outside observer that hasn't seen the type realization.
Yep. Okay, good. Okay.
Yes. But you're right. There's some cleaning up to do on that.
And Laura, there is also as a parameter, there is also a prior over all of these.
Yes, that is also missing. But for full disclosure, Alex and I have discussed a lot whether we should add the prior or not, and we tried many ways, and it always looked clunky. But I think Kaihao's question, we hadn't thought about it, and I think it's something to consider because it has to do also with the interpretation of the model. But the prior is important. The prior is important here, and you will see how important it is, and maybe we should represent it in the notation as well. Ricardo.
So Laura, I mean, we've been having this conversation about how to interpret this model, and I think it might be useful to throw it right now. So one way of interpreting this is as a sender-receiver game, where the sender's prior is the generate on one state. Let's say, so we have n different senders. Sender I has the generate prior on theta I, and then the receiver has some prior belief mu0. And now you're looking at what are the state contingent welfare functions that you can achieve when the receiver's prior shifts with information policy. So maybe that's an alternative way of looking at this as a multi-sender game where sender and receiver have different priors, and the prior of the sender is the generate on a particular state.
Yes, completely agree, and I'll come back to that. And one thing, going back to Kaihao, I think that I got myself confused. So it's not a type profile. So the state, if we're thinking about it as Bayesian persuasion, there's n states of the world, but only one will realize. So theta is not a product set. And then, as Ricardo was saying, it's like conditional on the true state being theta. What is the value, the conditional expectation of this function?
I see.
But there's no type profile. Sorry, there is a profile, but it's not a type profile. It's the profile has to do with the different realizations of the vector theta. And I apologize that I
see. Good.
Francesco knows that I was awake at 5:30 today.
I see. And n is the number of possible states. And
exactly. Yes.
Because
Yes.
you only need a finite dimensional vector to capture X post. So,
yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And sorry that I got myself tangled up with that. So just to make sure, so basically, we're going to take an approach that's complementary to other literatures. So if you think about algorithmic fairness, usually they fix properties information structure has to satisfy from the get-go, and then remains agnostic about the population's payoff or the planar social welfare function. Instead, we're going to allow for all information structures, but we're going to take more of an economics point of view where we are going to presume that we know the payoffs in the population. But again, the set will allow us to express any social welfare function. So we're also not going to take a stance there. And we're going to complement information design literature, which usually provides tools to characterize the average welfare of the base welfare profile. And we are actually going to be focusing more on the payoff distribution in the population that underlies that average. And hopefully when I go through examples, this will become more clear. Now, this is also a good time to say what the paper does not do. We will have very little to say about other things that people worry about when they think about algorithmic bias, for instance, which is data that is endogenously generated. There are two parts of our model that will allow you to capture some sort of bias that you might be worrying about. One is the prior. As it will become clear later on, the prior need not be the true distribution of types in the population. It's the prior of the outside observer, and this might be mistaken. This might be the result of endogenous bias data. And the other thing is that the welfare function is already capturing the combination of the payoffs in society with what the outside observer might be doing as a function of beliefs. So that's another way in which we might be able to incorporate bias. The other thing is that we are going to be focusing mostly on a single outside observer because we're going to be focusing on belief distributions. And therefore, if you wanted to think of multiple outside observers, we are restricting ourselves to the case in which their interaction is governed by a public signal. So just for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend time on this slide, but as you will see, I will cover a lot of literature as I go along the presentation. But if you think that I'm mentioning someone's work, please let me know. So I'm going to try to do probably 3 out of 4 of the things that are listed here. I'm going to start with the belief-based characterization of the base welfare set. And then I'm going to zoom in on the Pareto frontier of this set, which given the applications that we are concerned, seems like a focal point. And then I'm going to specialize the results to the case in which the welfare function is the expectation of some random variable. So for the first 2 parts, I will put no structure on the welfare function except for the example, but then I'm going to show you how our characterization refines and also has new flavors when we look at the linear case. I won't probably get to section 4, which is data limits. So what do I mean by this? As I showed you, I'm going to define information structures as these mappings that can arbitrarily condition on individuals' characteristics when disclosing information. In many applications, you might think that this is too much, like there are protected characteristics on which we cannot provide information on. We can extend our results to that case. And actually, in that section, we have results regarding whether it's welfare increasing or decreasing to blind algorithms. And in our case, we will show that it's going to be welfare decreasing to blind algorithms. And it allows us to explain why sometimes blinding algorithms is recommended and sometimes it's not. But that's just a preview of something that I'm probably not going to show. So let's go back to what we have to do. We want to characterize the set of welfare profiles that are induced by some information structure. And the first challenge that one might have in trying to think about this in the usual Kamenets-Angenska way is that where the welfare profile depends on the distributions of posteriors conditional on theta, whereas the usual Kamenian-Gentzkow approach depends on the unconditional distribution over posteriors. Now, you might think this is just semantics, but conditional and unconditional posterior distributions behave very differently. So from the ex ante perspective, so unconditionally, sequences of posteriors are martingales. They will eventually return to the mean, but conditional expectations conditional posterior distributions will satisfy a property that we call drift towards the truth. So what do I mean by this? If we fix a given type and an information structure, and we just calculate the belief that you might have after seeing the signal that the agent's characteristic is theta, and you take the ratio between that and the prior, and now you take the conditional expectation, conditional on the event that this is a true characteristic of the individual, this ratio will be greater or equal than 1. So the martingale property would make this equal 1, but what this says is that conditional on the true state being theta, you become more convinced that the true state is theta. This result is going to come out as a consequence of our characterization of the linear case, but it's a result that goes all the way back to Gould, and then Franzetich and Krebs also derive it as a function of the entropy. So at this point, we can take two possible routes. One is to characterize conditional posterior distributions. And in fact, this is where we started. And we didn't find the characterization for our purposes illuminating, but Levy et al. And Ariely et al. Have some very nice papers where they've managed to make use of this characterization for different applications. So instead, what we are going to do is incorporate this truth drift, this adjustment that shows up in the from the failure of the martingale property, in a sense, to the welfare function. So what do I mean by this? So I can write, we're going to do some algebra, and I'm going to go very slowly, and it will be easy algebra, but just so that people don't get tangled up with the formulas. So this conditional expectation of the welfare function, I can fix a belief and group all the signals that lead to the same belief for the outside observer. And then I can divide and multiply by the unconditional probability of observing that signal, and I can divide and multiply by the prior. And this object over here is the updated belief that the agent is theta, and I fix a belief already, so I know what label that is. So now I can write the expectation of the conditional expectation of the welfare function as the unconditional expectation of the welfare function corrected by this drift that I showed you before. And I'm going to call the product of these two terms W hat. So basically what we just shown is that for any information structure and any fixed characteristic, we can think of the conditional expectation of the welfare function for that characteristic as the unconditional expectation of this function W hat. So we're going to call this a truth-adjusted welfare function. And what this is capturing, and we're about to do an example to see this in pictures, is capturing the two things. One is the payoffs that the individuals have for a particular belief, but also the resource constraint in the economy, which is base plausibility. So one way to think about this is individuals of type theta have a budget equal to the prior that they can assign to different beliefs. And this truth drift will make sure that we split the belief, the budget mu naught, in the correct way. Now, this transformation, this sort of change of measures, has appeared in the literature before, so by no means it's ours. And one thing we've been talking with Ricardo is that you can take their model of persuasion with heterogeneous priors, where they show how to adjust the sender's payoff function by the likelihood ratio between the receivers and the sender's prior. To also obtain this characterization, as Ricardo was saying, you should think of, we have n different senders with the generate priors on theta, and it will give you the same same characterization. We're going to be using this object in a different way than these papers, because we're going to be using it to capture, in a sense, the welfare profiles in the economy.
And you get a better name. Truth drift is really catchy, I have to say.
Well, thank you. I cannot take credit for that. That's all Alex's brilliance.
All right.
So I think it's a good time to do an example. So just to give names to things, we're going to call this an online marketplace. So we have an online marketplace that has two types of sellers, low and high quality. And the consumers in the marketplace ex ante think that both types are equally likely. And all else equal, consumers prefer to buy from high quality sellers. So we're going to capture this by saying that the seller's profits, that's what the welfare function will be. And now I can see, so Max said that the poster was because of gold and welfare. So here we're going to be thinking about profits. So that's, I think that we found the correct match. So basically the welfare function will capture that as the consumers become more convinced that the seller is of high quality, they become more likely to buy. So they buy with probability 0 if they are very pessimistic, with probability 1 if they are very optimistic, and they flip a coin for beliefs in the middle. So if you think about a platform designing its recommendation algorithm, the platform will be choosing, in fact, a profit profile in the base welfare set. And you might think that the platform, for instance, has to satisfy outside options that the seller have, so they might want to choose information policies that bring the sellers into the platform, if you're thinking about how this would show up in an application. So we have a very standard sort of shape for the welfare function in terms of the Bayesian persuasion setting, but let's think about what the truth-adjusted welfare function looks like for the sellers of different types. So let's start with the low quality seller. So they get the drift adjustment. If we think of mu as the probability of being high quality, their drift adjustment is 1 minus mu over 1 minus the prior. And as you can see, even though ex ante the sellers or ex post the sellers would love to have high beliefs, low quality sellers can induce the highest beliefs only with a very small probability. So if you need to induce a belief of 2/3 or more, then the low quality sellers can only be represented in that recommendation with at most 1/3 probability. And that's how the truth adjusted welfare function captures both the payoffs, but also the possibility, the budget constraint for these types. The flip side of this is that the high quality sellers actually get a big boost in payoffs because they can disproportionately be represented, in a sense, relative to the low quality sellers in those high beliefs. So you can see that even though exposed, these profits do not depend on the types of the sellers, the welfare function, these truth adjusted welfare functions end up being type dependent. So once you have the truth-adjusted welfare function, the first thing you can do is to characterize individually feasible welfare levels. Because basically what the claim says is that if I want to think about the welfare of individuals with a certain characteristic, then I only need to consider the expectations under distributions that are over posteriors that average out to the prior. This is what this notation means, of the truth-adjusted welfare function evaluated at a given type. And this is something that we know how to do from Oman Mashler, Kamil Sangenska, and all these papers. So if we go back to the picture, let's focus on the low-quality sellers. what this says is I need to calculate the convex hull of the graph of the function of the truth adjusted welfare function of the low quality sellers. And then I look at the section at the prior, and that vertical orange line is the set of welfare levels that I can give to low quality sellers. You can do the same thing for high quality sellers, and the blue vertical segment is the set of profits you can give to high quality sellers. And you could think of this, you do it for the welfare function unconditionally. This will give you the average profit levels that you can give to the sellers. Now, one thing to note is that what is individually feasible might not be jointly feasible. So it would be great if we can maximize everyone's utility simultaneously, but usually this is not why we care about welfare economics. We learned this in intermediate micro, that there's a tension between efficiency and, for instance, equality and fairness. So this becomes interesting when there's a tension, like most generally than not, we will face a tension between maximizing the profits of low quality sellers and of high quality sellers. And this is where our framework becomes useful. So for instance, note that if we wanted to maximize the profits of the low quality sellers, then what we would like to mix between beliefs of 1/3 and 2/3, whereas high quality sellers actually want to be separated a little bit from the low quality ones. So if we wanted to maximize jointly, we will have a problem if just by looking at what's individually feasible. So, sorry. So what are we going to do about this? So we're going to take the truth adjusted welfare function and treat it as a vector valued function. So for each belief, it will give us a profile of payoffs, one for each characteristic. And taking that perspective, we're going to obtain our characterization. So basically, what is going to be the base welfare set? We're going to take the graph of the vector valued truth adjusted function. We're going to take its convex hull, and then we're going to take the slice at the prior. And that will give us the set of vectors, of welfare profiles that are jointly feasible in this economy under some information structure. So you can think of this as a vector valued version of the resulting Kamenitis-Hangenska. But what this is, the important thing that this is buying for us is that it gives us what can be achieved simultaneously for all types in the population. So just to go back to our example, this is the same welfare function that I showed you before, but I put the beliefs in the vertical axis, so that's why it looks funny. If you look at then you can look at the truth adjusted welfare function, and then you can take the convex hull of this, and then you take the section at the prior, and this gives you the base welfare set. So we're singling out here the full disclosure profile, where high quality sellers get full profits and low quality sellers, no one buys from them. The no disclosure profile is 50-50 because the prior is at a half. And then you can see that very quickly that, so if I should do a 45-degree line, but the 45-degree line goes through the no disclosure profile. So even though the sellers expose the same about profits, because they cannot be featured in the same beliefs with the same frequencies, they benefit very differently from different information policies, and the ability to generate profit profiles is very asymmetric across the sellers. And I'm going to, just for the sake of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster here, but you can see that there's a lot of opportunities to think about Pareto improvements, and now we're going to think about the Pareto frontier of this set for a bit. And the other thing to note is that this is a case, but this is not always the case, where full disclosure and no disclosure are Pareto ranked. So no disclosure is not in the Pareto frontier, and where full disclosure is, but this is a feature of the example and it's not general.
So Laura, I just wanted
yes,
to point out again, and I think this is possibly useful, that to this point in the talk, there's nothing really pinning us down, pinning down W as a welfare function. So all your results, all your the characterization of a state contingent attainable values of W is general and could be used in many circumstances. It's only when you characterize the Pareto frontier that somehow the results speak to a welfare function. So, I mean, I wanted to point out this because, you keep on, if you see this only as welfare, as a paper about welfare, it's a very restrictive view. That's my point.
So I appreciate the comment. So basically, I think just to follow up on that, there is an older version of the paper where we have like we also point out all the results that one could how one can enrich like typical information design settings. So a typical example would be like my work with Vasiliki, where we have mechanism design with limited commitment. The agent is privately informed about the state and the principal is designing an experiment. But then this experiment has to satisfy incentive compatibility constraints. And then what we call the base welfare set is a way of capturing the incentive compatibility constraints in the economy. So from that respect, I agree that this object underlies applications that go way beyond the one that we are pointing out. The thing is, at some point, we also thought that this application we think is very important, and also it's hard to keep telling two stories.
Okay.
So that's why we focus on this one, because I think that this is something that first there's many applications now coming that where this is important, but also where again caring about the payoff distribution might be very relevant.
All right.
Okay, how I feel you were going to say something.
Yes, I think you might be planning to talk about this, so feel free to postpone. Is it right that once we start thinking about welfare, we're going to have some supporting hyperplan? And if we want to maximize welfare, we're going to maximize the inner product of that hyperplan with this feasible set. And
Yes.
for a particular hyperplan that corresponds to the prior distribution, we're back to Bayesian persuasion.
Yes. And if you give me a couple of slides, I will go over that, because that will be in a sense intrinsic to a characterization of the Pareto frontier.
Yes, and so we can think of, now we're going back to Ricardo, we can think of characterizing the Pareto frontier as solving a persuasion problem, but with a different prior.
Yes,
where the
exactly. So
interpreted as the supporting hyperplan.
Yes,
yeah,
indeed. So that will actually help me to go faster through that slide. So for the sake of time, let me skip the result on cardinality, but I will. So you can use Theorem 1 to basically put bounds on the number of signals that go in an experiment. But let's go to the Pareto frontier. So I think that given the interpretation that we have now about the model, the Pareto frontier becomes like an important focal point if you think about a social planner making a choice, or society bargaining over the algorithm that they're going to implement. And just to point out, we're going to use weak Pareto optimality. So in the online marketplace example, we're going to get the flat part and also the downward sloping one. So basically what I will do now is characterize, as Kai-Hao anticipated, the Pareto frontier as a solution to a family of what we will call supporting Bayesian persuasion problems. And along the way, we're going to be providing basically a characterization of the boundary of the base welfare set. So if you give me any point in the Pareto frontier, I should be able to find a direction that's non-negative, such that the expected value of the welfare profile under that direction lambda, or the inner product between lambda and the welfare profile, is basically the solution of maximizing the linear function lambda on the base welfare set. And using Theorem 1, basically what I need to do is to find a base plausible posterior distribution that maximizes the lambda weighted value of the truth-adjusted vector, the vector value truth-adjusted function. So because we're focusing on non-negative directions, we can make these directions beliefs. And now let me go very briefly again through what Kai-Hao mentioned. One way that we can interpret this, and this comes from welfare economics, is say, well, there's a utilitarian planner. He has some weights over the types, and these are the weights, and then you're maximizing utilitarian welfare. But lambda, as I said, we can normalize it to be beliefs. So basically, lambda cross W is the expectation under measure lambda of the welfare profile W. And therefore, this means that if we are maximizing in the direction of the prior, we're going back to Kamenetz and Gentzkow, and the rest of the Pareto frontier is basically different instances of Ricardo's model with Odilon. So this is, in a sense, going back to this very old idea in welfare economics that you can think about. There's the utilitarian planner could be thought of as having a different belief distribution than what's the type distribution that's underlying the economy. Now, something that you should also be familiar with, if you're familiar with Ricardo's paper, is that you can turn this heterogeneous prior problem of Bayesian persuasion into one where the sender and the receiver share the same prior, but the sender has a slightly different utility function that we are going to call b hat of lambda. So this function b hat of lambda basically summarizes now the welfare function and the trade-off between the planner's weight and the receiver's prior. And in Alonso and Camara, this would be lambda would be the sender's prior and mu naught would be the receiver's prior. So you're balancing the likelihood ratios with the Pareto weights. But this gives you a way to think about the Pareto frontier. So a welfare profile is in the Pareto frontier if and only if I can find the direction lambda such that W is the solution, or such that W is induced by an information structure that solves the Bayesian persuasion problem. So because W is convex, you can use this result to extend to all the boundary-based welfare profiles by allowing for more general directions. So we think of this as a complementary characterization to the one in Theorem 1. Why complementary? Because I would understand if someone tells me that in Theorem 1, we're telling you guys, you have to take the convex hull of a vector valued function. That seems numerically feasible, but daunting to do by hand. Whereas Theorem 2 gives you a way to characterize the boundary of this convex set by concavifying this real valued function. And this is something that somehow we feel more comfortable with because we've seen it more. On the other hand, Theorem 2 shouldn't be looked at as a substitute for Theorem 1, because many social welfare functions that we use, like those that come from roles or Nash bargaining, they are not expressed in terms of Pareto weights. Ex post, you will pick a point that corresponds to having maximized in the direction of some Pareto weight, but ex ante, you don't know which Pareto weight you will eventually end up using, and therefore having the characterization from Theorem 1 becomes very useful, unless you have a very good sense of like what points in the Pareto frontier you're going to end up. Now, Theorem 2 gives us also a way to think about the cardinality of the experiments of certain points, and we can, and as long as you focus on extreme points of the base welfare set, then you will be able to obtain the Kamenetz-Gentzkow bound of n beliefs for a signal structure to represent, to induce the base welfare profile. But this result also allows me to, in a sense, point out a difference between our setting and the typical information design setting. So I'm putting up in black the Pareto frontier of the base welfare set. And as you can see, not all points in the Pareto frontier are extreme. I would say most points are not extreme. And in particular, think of maximizing in the direction of the prior, you will obtain this like downward sloping segment. That means that all those points, all those base welfare profiles have the same average welfare associated to them, but they have very different implications as to how you are dividing profits between low and high quality sellers. So in a sense, not the profiles underlying the average are way richer. And if you are just thinking about the solving this in the Bayesian persuasion way and doing the Kamenisch-Amgenskow solution, you will have chosen an information structure that only uses two signals. And that will only give you the points here and here, but you wouldn't be able to obtain anything in the middle. So all the points in the middle are actually generated by experiments that need at least three signals. So in a sense, once you start caring about the distribution of payoffs across the sellers and not just their average profile, proceeding in the usual way might give you the wrong answer.
And sorry, I have two questions.
Yeah, of course.
Do we know anything about the extreme points of the set? Can we say, we know they exist, we know they're characterized by n+1 or n linear inequalities, but can we say anything about them? Or is this settings too general for us to say anything?
I think the setting is too general for us to say, but I think it's an interesting question to think about.
And that's maybe related to my second question, which is, so far it's very general. It's for any welfare function, the result applies. But even when looking at the sort of concavifying a real valued function case, the domain is multidimensional because you have potentially many states, and usually that's hard. So I was wondering if we put some structures on the welfare function, are there special cases where we can get, say, for example, linearity of the v hat function, so that we can just keep track of distributions of posterior means or something like that, that can make even sharper predictions? I was just wondering about that.
So the problem, so let me go back to, so I think the problem is a combination of having the truth drift and the W function. So to make it linear in beliefs, you will really need to make this constant, I think, out of the top of my head. This might be very strong. Or you could make this 1 over mu, which will be very trivial.
Really trivial. I see. So there's really no way to make v hat fi.
No, and not even now in fact, in the linear case that I think I'm going to jump to because of time, in the linear case, v hat will be quadratic. So when W is linear in beliefs, the v hat is quadratic.
Yep.
And it's just that you're carrying this, even if you make this constant, you have like a potential non-linearity coming from the truth adjustments, that when you make the thing constant, that's when you get linearity.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you.
No, thank you. So apologies for jumping. So one thing that we do in the paper that I will briefly mention is that you can think now about Pareto improvements. And a natural question to ask, for instance, is if we took no disclosure to be the status quo, when can we find a Pareto improvement over no disclosure? And we are going to say this, in this case, that all types benefit from disclosure. And this ends up being very connected to the value of persuasion. So where it follows from Theorem 2 that we can show that all types benefit from disclosure, that is, there is a Pareto improvement from no disclosure exists, if and only if when we look to the Bayesian persuasion problems in directions, non-negative directions lambda, the sender with indirect utility function b hat of lambda wants to disclose some information. So if you compare b hat of lambda at the prior with its concavification, then it's always, the concavification is always strictly above. So this is what Kamenz and Genskal call benefits from persuasion. And therefore, one way to think about no disclosure being in the Pareto frontier, you have to find one direction in which no disclosure is optimal, and a non-negative direction in which no disclosure is optimal. And the reason I also didn't want to skip this result is that there is a result in Alonso and Camara that, so to put some context, instead of just looking at all directions lambda, you're asking us the same question, but not only over all directions lambda, but also over all receivers priors mu naught. And in that case, the condition is very similar, but it's stronger. It's already in like it's a condition that can be expressed on the welfare function directly. And that's why we have, in a sense, if you look at the statements, they look different. The results are very similar in terms of the content, and the difference is that the objects over which we are sweeping over. So I'm going to skip this. So let me use the last 10 minutes to talk about a case that I think it's pretty standard in economics, which is when we think about the welfare function to be the expectation of a one-dimensional random variable. So you can think of this as being, for instance, the agent's productivity, like in Holmstrom. And this is thinking of welfare in this way is a standard way of modeling reputation concerns or image concerns or career concerns in economics. But also is the setting that people use to think about prediction policy problems. So these are problems where you can think that a decision maker, our outside observer, is selecting a treatment on the basis of the expectation of an outcome of interest. So if the expectation of the agent's creditworthiness is above a threshold, they get credit, and if it's below a threshold, they don't get credit. So formally, what we are going to assume is that the welfare function is the expectation given a belief mu of a vector that we're going to call the reputation vector rho. So we're going to refer to the individuals, to the welfare function as the individual's reputation. And therefore, the base welfare profile will be a profile of expected reputations. And without those, you can think that this vector rho is ordered so that lower index types have lower values of rho. So the nice thing about the reputation model is that it allows us to focus on the role of information as a way to redistribute welfare in the economy, because it should be pretty intuitive that all information structures lead to the same average welfare. So if I take the prior expectation of the welfare profile, it should always coincide with the prior expectation of the reputation vector. That's very much a consequence of the martingale property. So basically, when you think about what information does in this setting, is just determining how this ex-ante welfare is going to be distributed across the types. So I only have very few minutes. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how the characterization in Theorem 1 changes and related to some strands of literature, and then briefly comment on what the supporting Bayesian persuasion problems are in our setting. So basically, we can do the construction in Theorem 1 saying, okay, if a welfare profile is in the base welfare set, then there's a base plausible posterior distribution where this base welfare profile is basically the expectation of the W of the truth-adjusted welfare function. And you can write this in matrix form. And you can trust us that we did the algebra right. But basically, what this is saying is that a welfare profile in the linear case is a product of three terms the reputation vector rho, a prior normalizing matrix, which is a diagonal that has 1 over the prior in the diagonal entries, and this matrix of likelihood ratios or product of likelihoods that's in the middle. Now, this matrix is quite interesting. It's a completely positive matrix. And a completely positive matrix is not very different than the other formula, but just to be sure, it's you give me k non-negative vectors, you take their inner product, and you add them up. And we don't see them as much in economics. I think that we see them hidden, and I will show you one application where they are hidden. But they are very important in convex optimization. They show up a lot there. And you can think of this as symmetric, positive, semi-definite matrices with positive elements. The other property that this matrix has is that its rows add up to the prior. And the point of the next theorem is that these are all the properties that you need. So, in fact, any base welfare profile will be the product of a completely positive matrix whose rows add up to the prior with the reputation vector in this diagonal matrix, normalizing matrix. So you can think of this as base plausibility, and what complete positivity is doing is ensuring the balance of how reputation flows across the types. So in a sense, what this is going to make sure is that I cannot systematically be convincing you that someone of low value of rho has a high value of rho. I cannot like completely flip the ranking of the individual. So it will incorporate those kinds of restrictions. Basically, and we relate, I have very little time, so we relate this in the paper to the literature on higher order beliefs, and in particular, I don't expect anyone to read the slide, but just to just to have some background, these kind of matrices show up a lot in the literature that study higher order expectations, and they use properties that this matrix have because they have a fixed information structure. But what our theorem is characterizing is which of these matrices are feasible. And this is where complete positivity is key. So if you have an information structure, it will give you a matrix that has complete positivity as the property, but this, I think, was not well understood, and people were using implications of complete positivity that were relevant for their analysis. Now, let me just, with 2 minutes, I will just do 2 things. One is that we had this characterization of the Pareto frontier that came from looking at the supporting Bayesian persuasion problems. Something that was unexpected to us, but we think it's very nice, is that in the linear case, each point in the Pareto frontier is an instance of the problem of Russian-Seagal. So Russian-Seagal has this product structure that we were discussing with Kai Hao. And actually, if you're familiar with that paper, the direction lambda will give you the values to the sender, and the vector rho will give you the values to the receiver. And if you're not familiar to that paper, I'm happy to give more detail about the connection after we pause for the break. Something that's very beautiful about that paper, contrary to other studies that we have in information design, is that they give you tools to characterize precisely the properties of the information structure. And we use that in the linear setting to derive properties of information structures, for instance, when we want to maximize the utility of individuals with a given characteristic. Now, I should have had a button for to jump to the conclusions because I have less than 1 minute left. So basically, what we want to do with the paper is propose a framework that allows us to evaluate the welfare implications of different information policies. And we want to proceed in this like sort of mechanism design way where we are describing the limits of what can be achieved and the welfare trade-offs that come from choosing between different information structures. And therefore, we end up having a unifying framework to evaluate the welfare implications of different information policies without taking a stance on what the objective function the social planner has. And we're thinking about a bunch of future directions, like thinking about, for instance, social score design, but more generally, moral hazard. You could think of the prior as being determined by the actions of the individuals, like increasing your type via investments. And you could also think that instead of focusing so sharply on the welfare of individuals with given characteristics, you might want to think about coarser things like groups. And these are things that we're currently exploring and very excited about, but we will also happy to take suggestions on where to take this. And with that, I'll just say thank you for all the comments and the questions and your attention.
Okay, and with this picture of the welfare set, I leave it to Ricardo and Kai Hout if they have any final comments in no particular order. Ricardo is unmuted already, so he can start.
Okay, so first, I think an applause for the presentation. So I actually have two comments. So the paper is very clear in what it does, and it does that very well. So there's the first part, characterizing the set of attainable welfare, state contingent or type contingent or theta contingent welfare points. So that part has two parts. First, being able to use convex analysis by having this truth adjusted function, and that, as it came out in the conversation, I think that that's easier to explain with the work on the work that has been done on persuasion with heterogeneous priors. That part, and then what really is very nice is that this multidimensional concavification to explain what's attainable. And then the application, I think is you didn't have much time, but was also very, very, very interesting. Now, I want to throw another interpretation of the paper, which is the following. So we know one sender, one receiver. We know one sender, multiple receivers with different heterogeneous priors. This actually provides us with a model of multi-sender, single receiver communication model, where the senders have different priors, but they're all constrained to using a single information. So we can call it a single signal information policy, disclosure rule, whatever you want to call it. So I think that's something that doesn't come out of the talk. The fact that this is a multi-sender model, and I wonder if you can use that this machinery for a future paper in which, because what you have is the two ingredients: is multiple senders with heterogeneous priors and a single disclosure rule, which comes, as you pointed out, I think that was very nice, through bargaining. So this could be, a common reporting for schools, that they all have to follow the same reporting procedures, but there's good schools and there's bad schools. So there's a lot of applications for that, and analyzing analyzing that, follow that interpretation. So that's my only substantive comment about the talk.
This is very helpful. Thank you. We've as we corresponded a little bit, and I said we were too cut in our ways. We had thought of like the informed principle, where again it's like you only have one sender, and you could think of something like inscrutability that forces you into like one global experiment. But this is actually very, we should think about it. It's a very nice application, and my first reaction was at the beginning, like, why would they use one signal? But you're right that there are lots of, like, at the end of the day, regulation makes you use the same disclosure.
I mean, so this goes with the two interpretations of Bayesian persuasion, one as a disclosure rule you can commit to, and another as an experiment by an uninformed sender. I like the second one a lot. So that's why it's also it's kind of natural, right? So we but anyhow.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ricardo.
No worries.
Thank you, Ricardo. Kai-Hao?
Yeah, that's very great. Thank you for inviting me on board. I really, this is the second time I heard it. I still learn a lot. And so I was wondering, you mentioned that at the very end. So, and this is by the way a very high level question. So feel free to say that this is just empty. But I kept wondering, starting from the beginning, since your motivation is about either algorithmic fairness or some kind of inequality concerns in terms of decision making, the model is very abstract. So certainly there's the question that's asked is nested in there. But I'm wondering, when we think about algorithmic fairness, for example, or credit score, for example, the settings are typically there is one component of the state that's kind of payoff relevant, whether this person is going to default or whether this defendant posts risk in terms of bail decision. And there is another component, for example, some protected characteristics, your ethnicity, your gender, your so and so. And when we think about those, we're thinking we want to be efficient in the first dimension, to be more precise, but we are kind of afraid that efficiency and fairness, or efficiency and inequality, has a trade-off there. The general model, of course, can incorporate that by considering a very large and yet still finite state space where each state is a vector that has many components, and one of them is useful, the other is kind of characteristic and protected. But as we also sort of discussed during the talk, the characterization is general and therefore kind of hard to work with, because even the sharpest characterization still involves concavifying a real valued function with more than two inputs, or with a multidimensional domain. And so I was wondering, are there a little bit more specialized settings? For example, maybe a welfare function that's only measurable with respect to certain components of the state, and or maybe some specific directions of the welfare function that can reduce the problem to a lower dimensional one that captures the kind of inequality or fairness issue that we were talking about. One example is one exemplary question, which could be nonsense, but one exemplary question would be, is there a way to reduce the characterization of welfare set to a set that's of a similar form of that in the recent paper by Annie and Jay and Xiaosheng? There they consider an algorithm which is a Blackwell experiment, but explicitly say there's a payoff relevant state variable and action, and there are two groups that need to be protected. And I was wondering if there's a formal connection once we make some specializing assumptions between the characterization of the welfare set here and the welfare set there.
Okay, so you asked many questions. Let me start backwards, just because I remember better the more recent than. So the first thing is, and I actually, maybe I shouldn't have, this is because I skipped many things. I don't know if it's useful to go through the slides now, but basically there is a connection with that paper. In that paper, they don't model algorithms as information structures. So in that model, there is an algorithm takes covariates into actions. So it's more like a mechanism. There's no base plausibility constraint or anything. And basically what they are only characterizing is the accuracy, fairness frontier. They don't characterize the whole set of payoffs that can be obtained. But for their objective, in a sense, the problems are very morally related in the sense that we end up now focusing on the Pareto frontier. So you could think of their fairness, accuracy frontier as our Pareto frontier. They have an information design problem at some point where the information designer, what they can do is coarsen the covariates. But the algorithm is still a machine that takes actions. So, and in their setting, why would you want to coarsen the covariates? Because what they are thinking is the planner chooses the covariates and someone chooses the algorithm and they might not agree. So then you might want to, by coarsening the covariates, you might induce the person choosing the algorithm to choose different points. In our setting, we're going to, where we do model algorithms as information structures, we're going to get a result that sounds a little bit contrary to that, which says that actually you don't want to coarsen the covariates. The more you coarsen the covariates, the smaller the base welfare set you induce. But that is very natural in our setting, because if you think about it, you would like to have as much information as possible to be able to provide as much welfare as possible. And then if you have some concern about equity, you will have it in your welfare function, and then you will choose your equity privacy trade-off by choosing from the set. But in our setting, we're assuming that the person that is trying to maximize the pie is the one that's choosing the information structure. So one way to think about the result is that if in our setting we had someone else choose the information structure, then the planner might also want to distort the set, to distort that person's choice.
Yeah.
But this is only one of the things you said. And do you want to comment on that paper part, or should I answer the other things?
Maybe later.
Okay. And then the other thing you mentioned, and I fully agree that maybe we should have more. So there is something that's nice about the being abstract, which is the generality, but it would be nice for applications to simplify things a little bit. So, but the particular thing you mentioned about having some characteristics that are payoff relevant and some characteristics that are not, we have like some examples in the paper about this. And also computationally, it's nice to make, for instance, the quality of the sellers to be the payoff relevant thing, and then the protected thing, something that doesn't show up in the pictures. But we can accommodate this. We can accommodate these kinds of applications in our setting, and the techniques are very similar. I'm not sure that we will ever end up in a situation where we don't need to concavify something, because that's sort of the nature of the belief approach. Yep. But we can do some of the things you suggested, and actually we do have like a nice example in the paper where you have the types being these two-dimensional vectors, and and we can speak exactly to this concern that you have between like being very efficient in decision making, but
yep.
But not in welfare.
I see. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you both for all the comments.
Since we are coming to 15 minutes past, I suggest we pause the recording and, thank Laura, Ricardo, Kai Hao for their participation.